everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of MICAST. This is your host, Kasturi.
And this is your host, Pallavi.
We are thrilled to have Deepak Gopalakrishnan on today's episode. Known widely on the internet as ChuckOfAllTrades, Deepak is a content and marketing freelancer and host of 3 different podcasts: The Origin of Things, Simplified, and Getting Meta. He's also the curator of his newsletter, Things of Internet.
It's always exciting as a MICAn to interview a super senior of ours. Deepak is also a MICAn from the batch of 2009. And to top off this incredibly impressive body of work, Deepak also teaches digital marketing.
We're so glad to have you here.
Hey, thrilled to be here. Been a fan of the show. You spoke to my former boss as well on the show once. So, yeah, really glad to be here. And it's really nice to see Micah doing something like this.
Okay, so we'll dive right into our questions.
Deepak, you've been self employed for several years now. Today, you're a successful content maker, a podcaster, a marketer, and a teacher. How do you manage to play all these different roles? And does it get overwhelming on certain days?
Does it get overwhelming on certain days? Oh, absolutely, 100%. I will, despite my love for calendarizing things, there are days when things get crazy. But, all of these things, I think, are just learning experiences. You figure out, okay, what went wrong over here. You figure things out better next time. It's not like my first 3 months in freelance were complete hunky dory and things were going exactly as how I'd expected them to be. So yeah, you just keep iterating, learning along the way. I don't think I've got the formula down right. Even now, there are things I try to optimize, do better all the time. So yeah, hopefully we'll get there soon. I think it's just a matter of constant learning. Hope that answered the question. It's a fairly wide-ranging question that you asked, so my answer was also fairly wide-ranging.
That's okay. We'll get more specific actually with our questions. And you talked a lot about freelancing because that is, I guess, essentially your bread and butter, other than a bunch of other things that you do. But in the pandemic, there's been a push to the gig economy, right? And we are seeing now that it's here to stay, even with like outside of creative services, also your Ubers and Olas of the world, your Swiggies and Zomatos of the world. What does one need to bring to the table when it comes to specifically your type of freelancing, which is pursuing marketing as a freelancer?
Yeah. Firstly, freelancing is my bread and butter. All the other things, they really don't, they're just side activities, hobbies, whatever you want to call them, right? So freelancing is not mainly my bread and butter, it is my bread and butter. I just wanted to clarify that as well. Yeah, you're right. I think the freelance economy, I think, is definitely here to stay. And I think for a lot of people who are listening to this show, I think this is more relevant than ever before. Over the last 3 years, I've seen a lot of people from the fields of technology, content, UX, design, marketing, content, etc., uh, taking more steps into freelance. There's been more interest. A lot of people who have been asking me, hey, how did you get into all this? Like, I've been speaking to a lot of people, trying to help them out in terms of making a decision on whether to go freelance or not. So the interest is definitely there. I think the more specific you are with your offering, the better things will be for you, right? And let me kind of try to illustrate that with another industry, which is writing, right? If you just offer yourself as a writer, uh, the problem is, I mean, you guys, most people listening to this might be students of brand marketing and all that, right? It's very difficult to position you or pin you down somewhere. On the other hand, if somebody goes and says, hey, I'm a B2B writer, I specialize in SaaS writing and that kind of thing, they may not have work immediately for them. The entire universe for them narrows down a little, but the fact is they will be remembered more by the people who really matter, right? One truth of freelancing is that it's not like there are opportunities available to you. There are opportunities, but it's not likely that they're there immediately, right? So out of every 10 people who you write to, only 2 or 3 might have work for you immediately, and even that might take time to convert, right? I feel it's more important to, like, okay, like when we study brands, we always say that, right? Like, just make the brand so memorable so that when people eventually want to buy the category, they think of you. Freelancing, I think, is kind of like that. And I've used the example of writing, but it really comes back to any form of any form of freelancing. Like you asked me about marketing freelancing. Now, I, for example, try to have a focus on startups, for example, right? And I have been referred by people who I have worked with. startup wise to other startup founders, which is great for me. And blanket advice across the board: the best business development that a freelancer can do is to have a happy, satisfied client. They will do the business development on your behalf. I think that's one. Try to get to some level of specialization. Now, it's not an easy thing. It's not, I mean, to be honest, if you were to ask me right now, I don't have a very nuanced answer to give you. Startups is just something that I can tell you right now, because the last 3 4 guys I worked with were startups. So it's like, oh, okay, is that a trend? They say, right? Once is twice is a coincidence, thrice is a trend, something like that. So it's kind of like, you can say fourth is a LinkedIn specialization. I suppose you can just extrapolate that that way. I think that's one. Try to work towards some sense of specialization. And two, to pursue marketing freelancing successfully, I think it's important to then figure out, hey, okay, if a client is coming to me, what is it that I offer that somebody else will not be, say a traditional agency will not be able to offer? My point of view when I approach clients is, hey, listen, I'm going to give you neutral consulting advice, because I work on short term projects, I don't work on retainers. So you can count on me to give you 100% neutral advice that I believe in, right? So if I think that, for example, Instagram does not work for you, I'm not going to recommend it, because I have no vested interest in making that retainer of you. I think those are two things specific to marketing freelancing. Apart from that, I mean, the usual stuff: stay organized, get your finances in order, and more importantly, for anyone looking to get into freelance, be clear on the reasons why you want to get into this thing, because this is not a route for you to make a lot of money like startups or something. There's a lot of hard work that goes behind it in terms of business development and all that. Be clear on why you want to get into freelance. Is it more control over your time? Is it more like you want to do this while pursuing some other creative passions of your own? The clearer you are on that, the more life becomes easy for you later. Hope that broadly answered that question.
Yes, Shakir actually definitely did, and it was a very honest take on the entire path of freelancing, where you actually explain the pros and the cons, and like how exactly, like if somebody, even if they don't want to go for marketing freelancing, maybe like in general, anyone who wants to opt for that route, what all they should keep in mind before doing that. We also want to talk about another aspect or another interest of yours, that is your newsletter. So, in a content clutter world, your popular newsletter, Things of Internet, is one of our main touch points with the world of the internet. And personally, I am a fan of it and
Oh,
I've
thank you.
been following it for quite some time. So, what goes behind producing the newsletter and remaining relevant and providing relevant content to the audience?
I read a lot. I have a lot of newsletters that I myself subscribe to, and I have a lot of different references for the content from there. And you rightly use the word curation. I always think that my job is more curation rather than writing, although once in a while I do go off on an editorial rant once in a while. And I mean, I just spend about 4 to 5 hours, not 4 to 5 hours, probably a lot more than that, just purely reading on a weekly basis. And a lot of what you see in the newsletter is just a distillation of all that I end up reading. Really, that's really what goes behind producing the newsletter, unless you want me to get into more specific aspects like which platform and all that, which I don't think really matters. But yeah, I think it's really just that. One benefit of running a newsletter like this, interestingly enough, I hardly subscribe to any marketing newsletters at all, apart from like 2 or 3. I make it a point to try and get in references from as many different spaces as possible. And that's, if there was one thing I could say to any student of marketing on this podcast, it is, for inspiration, look at spaces that are not classically marketing, right? You'll be surprised by, and I'm sure a lot of MICAns actually do things like this, because this is a very MICAn thing to do. uh, 10 lessons from marketing from the world of rock music, for instance. That's a very good way of just looking at life itself, I like to think. So yeah, that's pretty much what goes behind the newsletter. I think it's given me a lot of joy and satisfaction, just doing that. I have no plans to really take it to another level or anything. I'm just happy. It seems to serve the purpose for what I had started it out as. So yeah, that's pretty much what goes behind.
So let's talk about some of the podcasts you host. The Origin of Things has a very entertaining catch where the audience tries to guess what the brand origin is while you're narrating it, and if they get it before you do, it feels like a win while you're listening. Then you have
Thank you.
Simplified, which is like a deeper panel style dive into topics that are like in the cultural zeitgeist at the moment. And then finally, more recently, you have Getting Meta, which is, unmasking the processes of accomplished people who, those are processes anyone can apply to their life and kind of make their life a little more better. So, one, what's it like hosting multiple podcasts? And if you can tell us a little bit about the process for each one, because since they're so diverse, I'm assuming there's a little bit of difference in how you go
Yeah.
about making them.
Yeah. So, firstly, I know it sounds like a lot doing three podcasts. And then, by the way, you can add a fourth one also if you like, because I host the podcast for Cult Fit, which is called One Rep at a Time. In fact, working with a couple of MICAns
Oh, yes,
only
I've
for
seen
that.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah, there
yeah.
we go. So, that's you can technically add four. So, while it seems like a lot, here's how I'll break that down. So, I'm leaving the cult podcast aside because that's technically work for me, right? So I'm not counting that as part of this, although I'll give you the lessons or insights or whatever it is from there if they are useful. As for the other three, it's important to realize that Simplified is the only one that has any sense of continuity. It's the one that's going on week. My initial idea was to have either the origin of things or getting meta at any point of time. So right now I'm working on season 3 of Toot, the origin of things, and hopefully should be out in a couple of weeks or so from the time of recording this particular show with you guys. And getting meta, well, let's see. That's the post Toot season 3 thing to think about and to worry about at that point of time. So I just wanted to mention it might seem like a lot is happening, but honestly speaking, at any point of time, there's only 1.5 podcasts actually running. In terms of how it all came together, I think I got hooked onto podcasts pretty early. Like, and when I say early, I mean early by Indian standards. It's only right now that it's started gaining some level of not even mainstream acceptance. I would still say and forgive me for using this term, the MICA crowd. It's still permeating the audience only now, right? But I've been listening to various shows since 2013, 14, stuff like that. One of my favorite shows, still remains one of my favorite shows, is called The Bugle. The Bugle is a comedy podcast, satirical comedy show. It was then hosted by Andy Zoltzman, who's writing on Cricinfo. I was a huge fan of, and this other British comedian called John Oliver. Of course, John Oliver became hugely famous after that, and because of his commitments, he had to leave the show. And now, the Bugle is co-hosted by Andy Zoltzman and a bunch of other rotating cast of comedians, including our own Anuva Pal and Aditi Mittal at various points of time. It had a deep influence on me, and I always wanted to do a show like that. And long story short, that's basically how Simplified ended up being born. I always wanted to do a project like Simplified, and there was another friend of mine with whom I always wanted to do something. Right, so both of these things came together. We took the notes, the voice recorder on our phone, switched off the fan, and we started recording. That's pretty much how Simplified was born. And then it also helped that we were one of the first few Indian podcasts to actually start out there. And there was this young company called IVM that was looking for independent voices, etc. And so we were just lucky to have a show at that point of time, because right now, obviously, standards and all that are a lot higher. That was Simplified. The origin of things. Again, all my shows have inspiration. Everything that I do, I think, has had inspiration taken from somewhere. There was this show called The Way I Heard It by this American content creator called Mike Rove. When I say content creator, he's done a bunch of things in television, podcasts, audiobooks, all that sort of thing. The way I heard it was basically the story of a person, but then that person would be revealed only at the end of a very dramatic 7 to 8 minute story. Right. So if you're familiar with the origin of things and what I try to do for brands, that is exactly the same thing for people. Then I said, wow, this is a fascinating idea, and I'd love to do something like this for brands. I went, pitched it to IBM, they loved it. So that's how the origin of things came about. So it's a show that means a lot to me, and by the response, it clearly means a lot to a lot of other people as well. So there are 2 seasons and 50 episodes up, and I think that's pretty much one of the content exercises that I'm really proudest proudest of. That is the origin of things, and season 3 is coming up, which is not brands, because there are only so many brands that one can find an interesting origin story for. So this season is going to be something else. This is why I called it the origin of things and not the origin of brands. I knew one day I'd have to diversify, as they say. Getting meta, well, it was just a, I'd say, like they say, right, everyone should have sort of like a what, personal whim, or something like that. I always wanted to do an interview show. That's really it. And again, for me, the inspiration over here, there are a couple of shows that acted as inspiration. I'd say the one that acted as an inspiration the most would be the Tim Ferriss show. For those who are unaware of what the show is one of the top podcasts in the world, where American author and, I want to say, like, life hacker called Tim Ferriss interviews all sorts of celebrities from all kinds of spaces. Not even celebrities. Sometimes they're just very good experts and people who are really good at what they do. And one thing I've always admired about the show is how it's almost like the guest really doesn't matter. It's more about the habits of that guest that really matters. Like, for example, I heard a complete interview um, by with Arnold Schwarzenegger, for instance. Not that I have any intention of getting into bodybuilding, but his, like, little insights about how he organizes his life and all that. I mean, uh, it was those greater lessons, those meta lessons, if you were, that really inspired me, and I really wanted to do something like that, knowing that I had access to enough people who I could curate for at least 10 episodes. And that's really what Getting Meta ended up being. Interestingly enough, the first episode was with Amit Verma, who runs the Seen and the Unseen, probably India's finest podcast. And I told him, when we recorded, we didn't have a name for the show when we started recording, and I said, listen, you have a habit of saying these nice little phrases, so I'm going to pick what we are going to I'm going to write down some of them, and together we're going to pick a name during the recording at the end of the show. And then he kept saying Getting Meta with. So I said, how about Getting Meta for the name of the show? So that's how the name for the show itself came out. You'll hear it towards the end of the first episode. So yeah, that's really how the 3 shows distinctly came about. And I think by the process of explaining this, I think you would have realized that there's a different thought process for each of them. And honestly, even I would say not just a thought process, but I think also the seriousness with which I approach each of them is very different. Simplified, like I said, is just, sometimes we honestly even forget that we are recording a podcast, and we just have, like, I mean, we have that much fun recording it. An interview is a lot more of a serious affair. While the origin of things, because of the nature of the show, because it's me narrating, I need to be more dramatic while I'm narrating, right? So all these 3 are very different from each other, but yeah, I've enjoyed doing all of them. Whether there will be a Getting Meta season 2, I really can't commit at the moment. To season 3 is definitely in the works. Simplified will be there as long as IVM IVM for some reason stays delusional to the fact that we are still around on their roster. Till they kick us out, that's going to be there. So yeah, that's the shows. And by the way, I just wanted to mention one more thing. I think actually this might be interesting. So, on the basis of having done all these shows, is when Cult decided, hey, okay, this guy is reasonably into fitness and he's done shows, so let's get him to host the podcast. So, just a little side note over there in terms of how quote unquote free content can eventually land you a paid gig somewhere. Very analogous to how uh, many popular bloggers from back in the day, their blogs never used to make them money, but because the blogs themselves became popular, they would be commissioned by, say, a Times of India or Indian Express or something to write articles. So I think that's also an interesting leap in the whole monetizing freelancer economy, content economy, that sort of thing. I think there's an interesting little intersection there somewhere. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry, that's a
I
very long answer.
but I think we needed that level of detail given there were 4 podcasts being discussed.
Yeah, this is what happens when you get a podcaster onto a podcast. They'll never stop talking. So,
So, no, I'm really glad actually that you brought up cult again at the end. I'm glad we got to discuss that because it means that brands are also sitting up and taking notice of podcasting as a genre. And like, we've worked in podcasts now for a year, Kasturi and I, and we have an understanding of the podcast audience in India. It's a bit of an evolved consumer. It's not for everybody. There's a lot of barriers to entry as a podcast listener.
Yeah.
And so I want some of your thoughts on, with both things of the internet and your podcasts. One metric for success is how well you're able to build an audience for that content, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So can you take us behind the scenes on how one goes about building an audience that loves your content and believes in sustaining it?
Wow, that's a that's a really tough question, and the answer. Okay, the short answer is there is no way out apart from consistency. Right, I think that's the only way. If you are trying to do something for the explicit purpose, ki, oh, I want to build a community around this, it's not going to happen, right? It's you just need to be consistent. I think what really helps over here, and I'll speak to podcasts and content in general, especially when it's an individual who is creating it. If there's a shared belief or a shared goal or a shared topic, I think shows like that have a much higher propensity of having people drawn towards it, if that kind of makes sense. Right, for example, a friend of mine called Peter hosts a show on Indian rock and metal. Now, that's not the topic that has the highest amount of um, that's not the biggest audience in India, let's face it, right? But for what it's worth, I'm guessing pretty much everyone in the rock and metal community know of the show because he's spoken to pretty much everyone. There is got some good guests from outside and all that sort of thing, right? So the sharper your topic is. It goes back to actually the answer that discussion we were having on freelancing and trying to narrow things down. The narrower and sharper your topic and your stance, I think you stand a chance of collecting a community towards it, right? So I would not be surprised if you take any cause-led podcast or any community representing podcast, right? Like say an LGBTQ podcast or something like that, right? I'm sure that it will have a certain community around it, as opposed to say something that's say broader like the news or something like that, right? Because one is good for information, but you don't necessarily need to rally around a news outlet or something like that without getting into radicalization and all that topic for another day. Right. On the other hand, something that people might be passionate about, like say rock and metal or film, or something that people identify with and is a very important part of their lives, like say LGBTQ or fitness for that matter, right? If you're able to speak to them and if you are able to form a relevant part or be a relevant part of their lives, I think you stand a greater chance of forming a community. That is one, purely from an idea perspective itself. I think if the idea is solid, if the angle and the take, etc., is solid, I think the community naturally forms around it. The second thing is giving is explicitly making explicitly putting out opportunities where a community can coalesce. And I can't believe I use the word coalesce on a podcast, but so it is. By that, what I mean is this, right? If you're running a podcast and if you know it has a certain level of following, now podcast, because of its broken format, right, very clunky format it is in right now, there is no direct way for audiences to interact with the host of the show apart from pinging on a third platform, which is Twitter, Instagram, etc., right? There is, like, if somebody is listening to this show on Spotify and say, wow, we really loved that interview, or we really hated that interview with Chuck, why did you get him on? There is no way for them to do that on Spotify itself. They can only ping you or email you or whatever the case may be. So it's a little broken that way, right? So as a creator, you need to almost like create these moments or these events where people can somehow come together. So this could be in the form of contest, this could be in the form of acknowledging the fans on the show itself. Sometimes, like once at one point of time, Simplified used to do this thing called Profundity of the Day, where we would all read out the worst WhatsApp forward that all of us had received during the last week. And at one point of time, we asked our listeners to send stuff in as well. So it became a nice way for us to do that. And we knew that some very specific people used to listen to the show, so we would always make those inside jokes. It's okay if 99% of the people didn't get it, because that 1% is going to feel super like relevant or loved or whatever it is on the show. So we kept doing things like that. Simplified did we did one physical event, which was great. I think it was, whenever you do a physical event for what is largely an online product, I think there's just a lot of, you know, there's a lot of together spike activity, they call it, right, in marketing. Is exactly that for here as well. We did a couple of Zoom events as well. The Origin of Things, season 2 Origin of Things, was launched with 2 live events where I actually had prepared out 10 of the stories, and people were guessing in the comments as I was narrating. So if you hear, I think 10 or 15 episodes, I'm not sure, those were actually recorded quote unquote live, in the sense in the same room where I'm recording right now, but live for what it's worth. And I've seen some other podcasts do some interesting things like this. Now it could be in the form of merch, it could be in the form of events, it could be in the form of submit this and I will answer this, whatever the case may be. I think if you create those opportunities, I think people will come, or at least the fans of fans will really, like I said, I can't think of another word, unfortunately, at the moment, coalesce around it. So I think both of these are important. One, you need an idea that is amenable for coalition. You get what I mean. And two, you need to try and create those events. I think these are two ways that I would go about doing it. That it's not like you need to stick to these two though. You could just be like simplified. Honestly, doesn't fall into either. If you try to say, okay, what is that thing that unites all simplified fans together? We don't have anything like that. Maybe people just love most of the people who listen to us say that we just love the irreverent way you have a take on stuff. Fair enough. Well, I don't know whether that would fly as a new podcast in this day and age. I guess we had an advantage because we started off in 2015 when nobody else was doing something like this. As a result of which, organically, we have a few thousand, 20,000, whatever people listening to us on a weekly basis. So great. Um, but again, consistency, power of an idea, and creating those opportunities for spikes, etc. I think those really work. There are some podcasters who take their show a lot more seriously than I do, and I think many of them have done a very interesting job of connecting with their communities, creating Discord servers, love, and a lot of stuff that just happens. Now, if you want to make a podcast, then optimize for that. So be very clear on what you are optimizing for. I think this is very important, no matter what you do, right? Like the cult show, yes, I have fun doing that, but I'm very clear it's a client for me. There are certain deliverables, etc., that I need to meet, and I treat it very, very different from how I treat, say, Simplified, which is a very fun show for me, right? So I think it's a matter of that. I think it's really a matter of optimizing. I think it's really a matter of optimizing for the objective. Goes back to what I said about freelance as well. If somebody is getting into freelance to uh, make money, the advice I would have to give them would be very different from somebody else who, say, has had enough of working till midnight every day, and just wants a little bit of balance in their lives. The advice both are, by the way, very legitimate objectives. I'm not going to like say one is better or worse than the other. That is for individual people to judge what they want to do at that point of time. The advice that you give will really vary depending on what their objective is. I think the same thing works for passions and hobbies and things like that. If something is a hobby, let it be a hobby. Don't worry about monetizing that or something like that. Yes, maybe one day it will reach some level of scale, or you might have taken some skills which you can use somewhere else. Like somehow how I managed to take 7 years of podcasting, and eventually there was a client who paid me to run a show for them. Sure, a happy accident like that might happen sometime down the line, but I think the joy that you're saying is just because for me these three things are joy. The shows that I do are joy. Things of internet is joy for me. Whereas some of the other things I do, I know, okay, this is not necessary. I'm not deriving joy necessarily out of it. Joy comes and great, but very clearly it's a client deliverable. Money is what's important from this particular thing for me, or learning is what's important for me from this particular project. So I think it's really just a matter of optimizing for objective. It's also kind of like, as I grow older, lazier, and wiser, I think it's just also a way of compartmentalizing my life. I think in 20s is always this, oh, I want to do everything, and I think once you cross 30, I think you start, okay, let's trim things down a little bit. There are some things that are going to be for this, something for this, something for this, and things like that. So yeah, I think that's really just it.
So Deepak, now for a time for a quick trip down the memory lane. So
Yeah,
13 years ago, you graduated from MICA.
really, it's been 13 years.
Yes.
2022 minus. Okay, yeah, okay, you're right.
So
Wow.
what role has MICA played in your life?
I think MICA for me was a very big part of my identity when I got into MICA. Right, there was this forum called Pagal Kai. Not sure if it's all that relevant these days, but there was a bunch of us who were super crazy about getting into MICA and only MICAs, and we were known as a group of guys who were writing cat for the explicit purpose of getting only into. Or getting only into this institute, and I think that gave me, I know it seems kind of weird, but being a MICA aspirant was the first distinct online identity that I had back in 2005, 6, 7, that sort of thing. I didn't get through MICA on my first try and got it on the second try. And so just from that point of view, I was quote unquote the MICA guy, and all that sort of thing. So I think just from just for that, that was kind of important. I think MICA, then those 2 years in MICA really just, this might be a word that you guys, especially those who are studying on campus, might hear a lot, but not necessarily understand what it really means. This perspective, and perspective is just being able to place one particular thing in the larger, grander scheme of things. And if that sounds airy fairy to you right now, just wait till you're my age and it'll all make sense to you. And I think that's really what MICA does. I think it does it very well. And to be fair, I think any P school honestly will do this, which gives you the gamut of experiences that MICA does. MICA arguably does that better than any other. Uh, be it like placing one marketing activity in context of the entire brand, this thing, I think Micans are very good at that. They do never just look at an activity in isolation, like what will be for the entire thing, extrapolate that to life, if I may. I think, and it's not something that you learn while you're on campus, or it'll become immediately apparent 1 or 2 years after being on campus. I think you realize this a lot later, 13 years for instance, possibly. You go through a lot during this time. There are moments of tremendous joy and success at work. There are also like moments where you will have your hand in your head, tear out whatever hair you had left, and wonder why you got into this at all. You should have just taken finance. At least you would be driving an Audi, if nothing else, by this point of time. You meet all kinds of people. You realize what your strengths are versus other people's strengths. You basically go through the whole hog. And a typical Mican, at least the era where I had graduated, we had experiences across, right, agencies, clients, a whole bunch of other things as well. And me, because I've always done some kind of freelancing or the other, I got into a kind of like an unconventional role for a MICAN, which was OML and Insider at later on in my career before I got into freelance. So I think all these things put together, I'll be very honest. I wasn't really thinking about Gyani things like perspective and all that while this was happening. It's only once I stepped out of the entire circus and I was able to parse all these things together, did things start to make sense. I found the MICAN community to be super helpful and very knowledgeable about various spaces. It also helps that we actually end up doing some very interesting things as well. So you have some contacts in every industry and things like that. So yeah, I think all these things put together. I know it's not a very well thought through PowerPointable answer, but I think MICA has played a very, very important role in my life in various ways. Be it, but I think more than academically, it's the stuff that's outside the classroom and the thinking that really accumulates in your head, which matures like a good FD or something 15 years down the line. That's really the bigger value that Mike has given me, and pretty sure that'll be the case for you guys as well.
That's
Wow,
kind of
philosophical.
emotional. Yeah, I'm feeling kind of
Yeah,
emotional at the end of that
yeah,
answer.
became very
And
philosophical though. Sorry about that.
So talking about the MICAN community, we actually reached out to our student community and We said that
Dear
we
God.
have Deepak Gopalakrishnan coming in. What questions do you have? And we had an amazing response. We picked two out of them.
Okay, fair enough.
And
Okay.
yeah, so the first question is by Saransh Sharma. He asks, we love your podcast on brand origins, but we really want to know more about the self brand you've built as Deepak and Chuck. Can you give us that origin story, please?
Oh, good Lord, this. I was wondering when this would come in. It's actually a very, very sad story. So, when I was in college, and this was in Kerala, I used to make many, many, many very bad jokes. Still do, but I save it for the newsletter so it looks classy and all that. And in Malayalam, a bad joke is called chali. It's literally mud. It's slang for it literally means mud. So my roommate, who was frustrated with my attempts at humor, thought it would be a clever idea to combine the Mallu for bad joke and my actual name. So that's how Chali Deepak Chuck was born, and that is the origin of that story. Told you it was a very sad story, but
Oh
hey,
my
you asked
god.
for it, Saranj, so take it and go. By the way, the other option was instead of Chali Deepak, it was Chuck. The other option was Chaddi, which thankfully everybody vetoed. So please call me Chuck the next time you see me and not Chaddi.
Speaking of the name, and the name trend continues in the student questions, as your name suggests, Chuck of all trades, you have a very wide arena of information that you can pull from. And this is evident in all your creative pursuits. Any advice on how we can cultivate the same? This question comes in from Ira Kamle.
That's a great question. I think. Um, Okay, so I'm not going to give advice. I'm just going to say what I did, right? And hopefully that will work for you as well, because it's not like I started off my 20s with a big list of things and said, yes, by the time I am 38, I will eventually come on to Micah's podcast to dispense Gyan. So it's not like I had this game plan or something like that. I think I just was interested in a lot of things, and I read a lot of things, and by reading a lot of things, I don't necessarily mean that you need to block away 4 or 5 hours of your day. I realize that not people are into different things. Just from wherever your sources of information, entertainment, etc., could be from many, many places. They could be books, they could be articles, they could be YouTube videos, they could be Instagram, they could be a whole bunch of things. Just absorb. I think you should spend your 20s just absorbing information, absorbing experiences, absorbing good experiences and bad experiences, both at work, personal, all that. Travel, get out there, have good moments, have bad moments. You're almost, think of it this way: your 20s should be spent collecting raw material, and your 30s should be spent making sense of all of it, if I were to put it that way. And now, now I can say this with the benefit of hindsight. I think what I've gotten good at over the last few years especially is joining the dots, right? Which is, like I said, like we discussed a little while back, what are some marketing lessons that you can derive from how rock musicians have conducted themselves or something like that. Again, this is something that MICAns, I realize, are exceptionally good at, because many assignments and all that end up being things like this. Many dissertation topics, etc., are like this. So we are already coming in with this kind of bent of mind, right? We always look at other places for inspiration for a particular category, and I think that's something that you should always try and cultivate. But to a simple answer to Ira's question, just experience as much as you can in your 20s, 30s, etc., and 20s especially, and then try to make sense of it later. What you'll also realize is that, and this is kind of like many personal experiences plus thinking like a planner, which is what I had to do at work, which is you always try to extract multiple lessons from the same experience, if that kind of makes sense, right? Let me put it this way. If you're working on for example, if you're working on strategy for a financial brand, for instance, I don't know why I went to financial brand, but let's stick with it because I started it. um, think about what all you learn during the process, right? So one is, of course, you learn about the financial industry, blah 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 blah, right? Which you can hopefully reuse that information when you're making another plan for another brand somewhere else. Two, you also learn a little bit about strategy in general, which you can use for any brand that you're working on in the future. But apart from this, now think more, what else has this entire experience taught you? If it was a horrible experience, that's a very good thing in the long run, because you've probably learned a little bit better about how to conduct yourself, how to manage teams and things like that. I think some of the most valuable professional lessons that I have learned came during very, very bad moments. I can actually very specifically point to two or three incidents that happened during my professional life that led me to leaving advertising and then eventually becoming a freelancer, which we will not talk about on this particular show, not when the record button is still on, at least. Um, so it's don't have, if you're consuming content for fun and all that, please by all means do that, right? I don't want you to turn everything into a lesson, but consciously work towards, like, even a person who I think watches just a lot of videos on YouTube every day, there's some, if they just spend a couple of minutes thinking about it, there are some things that they will be able to string together. For instance, anybody, absolutely anybody listening to this would have 100% spent 2 hours of their time. They were supposed to work on a dissertation, but they got distracted by YouTube and went down a rabbit hole, and 2 hours later, dissertation was not done, right? So you can count that as time wasted, sure. But what you have also done is you've experienced a masterclass, a practical masterclass in what makes for compelling content. And I'll bet you that you'll be able to write an article on what makes for compelling content, right? These are the hooks, these are the things that got me addicted to this, or these are the things that these guys did really well. So every experience that you have will have something on the surface for sure, like how to do strategy for a financial brand, or how beautiful is this mountain, or how good is this book, or whatever the case may be. Dig a little deeper, there are also two three other things that you will have, and these sub sort of things are the things that really you can join dots with later. Again, don't you don't need to very consciously do this, it will come later. So I will again just go back to what Ira asked. Just experience a lot of things, go where your instinct really drives you to. It's never too late to start anything, cultivate an interest in something. And yeah, you'll make sense of it later. That's really about it. Chuck of all trades was started at the name came at a time when uh, I wasn't really thinking about of all trades or something. I just thought it was a cute pun on Jack of all trades, to be very honest. And if people think that it seems apt in retrospect, then great. That's all I can say. Yeah,
You manifested it.
I hope so.
So,
A
our final.
chuck of trying all trades, honestly, is what I would prefer it to be, but that's too long. So,
So, we're at our final segment of the podcast. I know we've had you here for a
hmm.
while, but the last bit is here. This is a rapid fire section, which we don't tell our guests about, so we get some genuine reactions from them.
Uh-oh.
Kasturi and I will go back and forth between a couple questions and just give us the first thought that comes to your mind. So, first question: what's a book you think everyone should read?
This is a great question, and I will give you the answer because I'm actually reading it right now. It's called Music: A Subversive History by Ted Goya. It's brilliant.
Okay. Coming on to our next question. We know you're a metal and rock head. Which album do we start with if you want to get into metal?
If you want to get into metal, oh wow, that's a bit. I'm actually just taking a second to look around the room. It really depends on where people are coming from, because I think what you are comfortable with has a huge bearing on, if you're coming from Bollywood, then I would possibly recommend something like the Black Album by Metallica is extremely accessible and it's got something for everyone. If you're already used to, say, something that's slightly heavier, like say a Bon Jovi or something like that, then I would probably recommend. The Number of the Beast by Iron Maiden, all-time classic. And if you're already used to something that's like heavy and you're already and it also depends on other experience, like if you watch like a lot of experimental films and you're generally used to zany art or something, Images and Words by Dream Theater will introduce you to a world of long progressive metal which with which you'll never look back. So these are just a few random ones. I mean, honestly, I could give you a list of 20 over here right now. And I think these days what makes for more sense is playlists rather than albums by themselves. I think when we can have a different discussion on this later, because of the changing format, the significance of the album has become less and less. So I think playlists matter more than albums these days, and I don't mind that at all, because I think playlists are a great way to introduce people to a genre. So, or very honestly speaking, just go to Spotify's top metal from the 80s or 90s, and you should be sorted enough. I might have a playlist lying around somewhere as well. So yeah.
Okay, and our final question: what's your favorite spot at MICA?
Was my favorite spot at MICA was always Amalta's 14. This was a room where I spent a lot of time, maybe a little too much time, but I would always be found in there doing something or the other. It was home. I wasn't too much of a extrovert and doing all sorts of other things. But that's, yeah, for me, that was a favorite spot. In retrospect, it should have been the jam room. I think. Thank you for not asking what my the mistakes that I made at my cover, and most of them involved a guitar in my hand with a captive audience in front of me at the auditorium. So it should have been the band jam room, but it wasn't. So yeah, Amalta's 14 for now will have to do.
Thank you so much for joining us. We
Great
had a
pleasure,
great
guys.
time. I'm glad that we got to ask you all kinds of questions and we really dove deep into a lot of things that we had.
Yeah. Super, guys. Thanks so much for
Okay,
this.
thank you so much.